And slaves added a lot to the culture of the city.
Ironically enough, it was the defeat in Saint-Domingue that basically caused Napoleon to change his idea about retaining Louisiana. Saint-Domingue is the richest colony in the center of the North American French Empire, and Louisiana was supposed to be the breadbasket.
Napoleon had no intention of selling Louisiana before he realized that he could not regain control of Saint-Domingue. Louisiana was going to supply food, was going to supply goods, so the solution would be simply to sell it.
I think everyone in Louisiana was concerned they'd lose any and everything they have. Imagine you had land that had been given to you by French and Spanish governments. Then all of a sudden you find out you're American. Now you've been turned over to these people who are always viewed with suspicion.
Americans coming in did not see that these people of color should have the same rights. You know, they were of a lower class.
Whites got the right to vote under the Americans. Blacks did not get the right to vote. There were certain privileges that were accorded to whites that were not at the same time given to free blacks. They protested against it, but again, they were not given it because if you were not white, you were black. It didn't matter whether you were free, you still were considered to be of an inferior status. One of the justifications for maintaining slavery was that slaves were members of an inferior race. How do you explain that if you have a society which is controlled by blacks that's thriving?
So as the Civil War approached, there were different things added to control some of these things that were sometimes quite repressive.
Before the Americans changed it, you had the right to acquire freedom by purchase. That became much more difficult after the American takeover, and of course between 1830 and 1860 it became almost impossible. At this particular period of time when the laws were gradually tightening up and more restrictions were being placed upon mobility, free blacks could no longer come into Louisiana if they had not been here already, and you see a large exodus of free blacks out of the state after 1845.
Recurring over and over again is the notion of exile, and within that exile, a kind of death. A remarkable number of poems actually discuss suicide. After the Civil War, the slaves were liberated, but at the same time, the Creoles of color suffered tremendously. They weren't really accepted by white society, and they weren't really accepted by the blacks, and they spoke French. What they got were Jim Crow laws. They could not be educated in English because they couldn't be accepted in English-speaking schools. So many of them would complete their education in France. They studied Voltaire, they studied the French Revolution, they studied ideas of the rights of man. And when that generation came back, their eyes were really opened to the injustices that were taking place all around them in Louisiana. Creoles of color were the ones who really led the fight in Plessy versus Ferguson.
The thrust of the Plessy case was that in 1883, the United States Supreme Court had ruled that state-imposed segregation was unconstitutional, but private discrimination was okay. If private hotel operators, people who operate steamboats, people who operate restaurants, the Constitution required equality. It did not necessarily mean sameness, that if in fact you could have equal facilities and they were separate, as long as they were equal, then it did not in fact violate the Constitution. For a long, long time, the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of these people understood very clearly the role that their ancestors had played in fighting to prevent segregation from taking place. Dr. Moriarty's ancestors, many of them were members of that old free black community before the Civil War, pushing for an end to any distinctions based upon race or color in society. The NAACP would enjoy a lot of support from the descendants of the old free black community.
It's come up many times since the storm about the possible loss of the Creole culture.
People are coming back because what they left, those of us who've been here for generations, my family's been here for over 200 years, you can't find any place else. But they didn't find that in Houston. They didn't find it in Austin or in San Antonio or LA or wherever they went. Louis Armstrong, discrimination ran him away. He would never come back, but he always expressed his sense of loss, what he had left.
In some ways, it is history playing itself over and over again. There are people who have left, but most people, when they want to go home, they want to go home. Our society is filled with stories about a return to home. The Wizard of Oz, which is nothing more than a story of going home and eventual success. That's part of our society. That's part of American culture, this notion of going home. And I think that that will prevail in the long run.